When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
Ah yes, the magnificent Trolley Sourbright Crawler, also known as Trollicus brightolus. The worm's captivating neon colour makes it an easy gummy prey.
Trolley!
It's a surprisingly sour, invitingly chewy, staggeringly snackable species unlike anything else found on this planet.
Eat me!
Delicious. Visit Trolley.com to shop now.
Trolley, eat me!
This content may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion advised.
We asked him what was up, and he replied, "Oh, nothing really. It's just that my friends are probably worried about me. They'll find out soon enough."
Something inside me told me I needed to get out of the area as quickly as I could.
We all froze, realizing that someone else was on the property. Our phones had no signal in that area.
From Killer Podcasts, true tales of horror, bizarre happenings, unexplainable events. This is Disturbed. Hello, and welcome back to the show. This week, we're bringing you 4 stories that will make you think twice about enjoying some solitude in the great outdoors. So sit back, listen closely, and dive into the horror. First, a story narrated by Terra Ashe from Reddit user Terrible Kraken. Creepy guy at LARP.
I'm into LARPing, and for those who don't know what that is, we basically spend the weekend in the woods dressed up as medieval fantasy characters. I love going to these events with my partner Casey and my friend Dakota, and we meet up with other friends of ours while we're there. There are all types of people at these events, but 99.9% are absolute angels. Before this fateful event, I had yet to meet the 0.1%, and I truly wish I never did. Before the event started, a guy named Greg swung by my tent as I was setting it up. Casey and Dakota were setting up a secondary tent further up the path and couldn't see me. There were 5 other people nearby setting up as well. I had never met Greg before, but as soon as he had said hi, I had a bad feeling. He was around 5'10", obese, and a neckbeard, basically what would fit the description of an incel. He approached me and asked if I was there alone. I said, "No, I'm here with other people," but I didn't mention Casey or Dakota directly. He asked if I was a gamer, and I replied yes. From then on, he started rambling about Ark Survival, which is a game I personally have over 3,000 hours on. He told me blatantly wrong information, misnamed the dinosaurs, and told me stuff that's impossible to do in the game, even with mods. Every time I corrected him, I could see he was getting increasingly annoyed. Finally, I ended the conversation, saying I had to go back to setting up the tent, and he left. Fast forward to around 10 or 11 p.m., well after the event had started. Now that we were in character, any mention of the real world, such as cars, TV, pop culture, etc., was forbidden by a rule called decorum. Casey, Dakota, and I were playing a campfire game with our other friends, and Greg came by to sit with us. He sat right next to me, and I instinctively moved away from him. He scooted closer, I moved away, and he scooted closer again. Eventually, I got up and sat next to Dakota. As we were playing the game, Greg kept referring to the real world, mostly video games. So we told him either leave or make an effort to speak properly. He left. The next day, I walked up a trail for some fake hunting, what we call gathering resources. As I came back down towards the village, he was there waiting for me on the trail. We were in the middle of the woods with no nearby camps and no one else around. He asked me if I would like to go get a coffee sometime, to which I answered, no thanks. I continued down the trail and he walked with me. I told him I needed to collect some plants for my potion, so if he could excuse me, I'd be going back to the village to leave my bow and arrow and collect my basket. I quickened my pace, but he followed me and grabbed my arm, saying I could come with you. You, me, alone in the woods, looking for plants? That sounds like the perfect scenario. I freaked out and pulled away from him, then hurried down the trail to the village. Some of the other LARPers saw me and looked very concerned. They asked if I needed help, and I told them, in all honesty, which is code for take me seriously, this isn't part of the game, that Greg was being extremely creepy and following me. When Greg showed up moments later, they told him to fuck off before they carved him a new asshole. I stayed with them a few more minutes until I felt safe enough to venture out and find my friends. That night, we were having a blast. There were some really fun fights and other encounters. I hadn't seen Greg since 7 p.m. and was feeling more comfortable, thinking he'd finally gotten the picture and would leave me alone for good. Around midnight, I stepped away from the others to go to the bathroom. As I was coming back from the bathroom, walking in almost complete darkness, Greg jumped out from behind a bush and pinned me against a tree. He told me he wasn't proud of me, that I'd been leading him on, that he didn't understand why I would hold another guy's hand and hug 3 other guys, but not him. I told him I hold my fiancé's hand and I do hug my friends, but he's neither of those. I told him, in all honesty, he needs to stop his bullshit, and he answered, but what if, in all honesty, I just want a little kiss, huh? Just one little kiss and then you can go. I yelled no and tried to hit him to get away. My friends who were right on the other side of a nearby bridge heard my scream. They took their fake weapons, called upon my neighbors, and around 10 people came careening over the bridge to help me. Greg let me go and turned to my rescuers, saying he was just interrogating me for information concerning our foes, the demons. My friends, who had already seen the guy being an asshole before, told him not to move, that they were going to get the owner of the LARP to come deal with him. Greg tried to dissuade them, but they told him to sit down or he'd be visiting Death's Altar before he could move. My fiancé gently led me away and comforted me. He was really concerned about what had happened. The owner came up to me and I explained what had happened. He took Greg away from the event to discuss his behavior. From what I heard, he was kindly asked not to come back to future events. To Greg, my medieval stalker, let's not meet again.
Our next story is told by Paul Brown about spring breakers who meet a mysterious stranger on a remote island.
So it was spring break in 2010. And my buddies and I decided to camp out on an island in Lake Ouachita. And one night as we were cooking dinner and drinking beer, a canoe floated by with one guy in it. He asked how we were doing, and we invited him to our island for grilled meat and beers. You know, being in South Arkansas, we naturally assumed that everyone was friendly and wanted to hang out. His name was Kurt, and he was super friendly, but seemed to be very sad. We asked him what was up, and he replied, "Oh, nothing really. It's just that my friends are probably worried about me. They'll find out soon enough." He looked at me, and then he winked. And that still haunts me to this day. Everyone liked Kurt, and it was getting dark, and he'd been drinking. We offered to let him stay with us for the night. He declined, saying that he had to get to where he was going. He seemed very adamant about that. And I asked where he was headed, thinking maybe, we could give him a ride there on the jet ski. Kurt ignored the question and said, "You boys don't know how lucky you are." Then he hopped in his canoe and left. His final words to us were, a bit odd, but we didn't think too much about it and continued on with our evening. The next morning, we woke up early and got out on the lake for some fishing. And as we were sitting there waiting for a bite, to our surprise, a police boat pulled up. The officer asked if we were part of the search party that found the body. We obviously had no clue what he was talking about, so he told us about a young man, only 19 years old, whose canoe had capsized last week. Although his friend was able to swim to safety, the teen was nowhere to be found until divers discovered his body at the bottom of Lake Ouachita just 2 days ago. The young man's name was Curtis Clark. This was so freaky to us that we all packed up and left camp that very day. I hope that Kurt got wherever he was trying to go, and that he found peace there.
You're listening to Disturbed. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by United Airlines. When you want to make the most of your vacation, book with United. They're an airline that cares about your travels as much as you do. United is transforming the flying experience with Bluetooth connectivity, screens, power at every seat, and bigger overhead bins to help fit everyone's bag. And with their app, you can skip the bag check line, get live updates, and more. Change the way you fly. Book your next trip today at united.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Welcome back to the podcast. Our next story is an email submission from Disturbed listener Martha, narrated by Hannah Robertson. If you have a story you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email to mystory@disturbedpodcast.com.
I grew up in a small town in the south of England and went to a high school that was a real mix of people from military families, commuters from London, and families with old money. In my final year, I made friends with a girl named Laura, whose family lived on a huge estate. It took 15 minutes to drive there from the nearest town. Behind the house, there was a lake with a boathouse. Stretching from the lake up the hill were woods, leading up to a big old ruined castle. Looking out to the other direction were rolling hills. The nearest house you could see from there was in the distance in the hills and belonged to the lead singer of Coldplay. That's the kind of money we're talking about in this area. My new friend Laura was wonderful. A beautiful, welcoming character with a huge rally of friends around her. She would often host parties at her house when her parents were away. This story is about one particular party that went wrong. It was an autumn night, and Laura's family had gone away for the weekend on a business trip, leaving her and her brother George to look after the house. Of course, George and Laura decided to invite friends over and have a party. The two groups of friends stayed quite separate. Laura's friends were all around 16, and we hung out in one of the living rooms downstairs. George's friends were at university and all hung out in the large kitchen area that led into a small living room. From there, you could walk out the back door onto a terrace area that looked out over the lake. There was a sort of stone archway that backed onto the terrace where George's friends would smoke. You could also see the lake from there and look out at the woods that led up to the castle. The night started out really chill. Everyone was having drinks and we were playing records from their dad's collection. A few people were smoking weed and cigarettes outside. Mushrooms grow naturally around that area, so a few people decided to take a trip. At some point, a small group of us decided to go outside for a cigarette, but found that the back door out of the living room had been jammed shut. We found a piece of wood blocking it and moved it out of the way, thinking nothing of it. But this happened a second time, and then a third time. By the third time, we also noticed there was dog shit smeared on the windows and the door, and the amount of firewood and stones blocking the door was increasing. At this point, we were getting a bit annoyed, so a couple of us went into the kitchen to see George and his friends. We asked if they would cut it out and stop blocking the door. We just wanted to go outside for cigarettes. They looked at us and said it wasn't them, then accused us of doing the same thing to them. At this point, we decided to take the 4 or 5 people who had taken a mushroom trip upstairs and away from the tension that was building between the two rooms. When we went upstairs, we found a couple of windows open, which had definitely been closed earlier. Never mind. We left the trippers to chill in a cozy room and headed back downstairs. We came back to the kitchen to find that both groups were still bickering about who was the one who kept closing and blocking the back doors. At this point, we thought there was just a joker among the group. As we decided to move on from the argument, someone looked out of the front window of the kitchen to the long driveway and saw that every single one of our cars had its doors open and the hazard lights on. Nobody had locked their cars. We were in the middle of nowhere and were all popping in and out to get things. Someone had clearly reached in and very quickly turned the hazards of every car on before running away. We all froze, realizing that someone else was on the property. Our phones had no signal in that area, and understandably, Laura and George didn't want to make a fuss on the landline because they weren't meant to be having a party in the first place. At this point, a couple people went out the front door to look around, and they saw some lights in the trees that led up to the castle. Suddenly, we all heard a gunshot in the distance, and then everybody in the party went into emergency mode. It felt like the beginning of a horror film. Before long, a group of boys nominated themselves to go up into the woods and work out what was going on. Classic men. But to be honest, we weren't arguing too hard with them. There was no way that I was going to go up there. As the boys began to run towards the woods, one of Laura's friends, affectionately known as Milli Vanilli, smashed a wine bottle on the table and screamed, "I'm coming too!" With her new weapon in hand, she ran after them. The rest of us watched from the back window, trying to see what was happening, but it was too dark. After a couple of suspenseful minutes, we heard a solitary gunshot coming from the wooded area. The boys ran back in through the door, out of breath and panicked. They heard the gunshot but didn't know what had happened. 5 minutes later, Milli Vanilli ran back, her jagged wine bottle covered in blood, shouting, "I shanked him! I shanked him!" Nobody knew what really happened in the woods, or where the gunshot came from. But somebody had surprised Millie from behind, and she'd instinctively gone for them with the broken bottle. 10 minutes later, we saw a row of cars retreating down the narrow single lane back toward the town. The whole thing felt so surreal. It was like its own kind of trip. The next year, I had gone off to university and didn't get to see Laura as much, but I kept thinking back to that night and wondering who those people were who decided to go so far out of their way to terrify a group of young people. I met Laura for coffee about 2 years later and couldn't help but bring it up. It turns out that the lake that sat on the grounds of Laura's house had always been used by the local traveling community as a place to fish. The far side of the lake sat against a public footpath, so there was an area where it was absolutely okay for the public to enjoy a day's fishing. 2 days before Laura's party, her dad had signed paperwork that prohibited the local traveling community from fishing at this lake. Laura found out that a few young people from this community had decided to get their own back, and to be honest, I can understand why. Laura's family had stopped them from doing something they'd long enjoyed, and in the eyes of some of the community, they'd fairly questioned why these wealthy landowners needed even more private space. I can see why this group of young people would have chosen to try and scare a group of slightly spoiled teenagers. I hope the one who was hurt is okay. Suffice to say, it's a party I'll never forget.
Our final story is narrated by Kat Carter from r/True Scary Stories. Never hunt alone.
This happened back in the fall of 2016. I live in a very small rural community where everyone knows everyone. The state that I live in allows rifle mule deer buck hunting during the first week of October. Sustenance hunting is very important in the culture of my area. That particular fall, I was lucky enough to have drawn a buck tag. I'd made plans to hunt on my grandmother's farm one evening, and given that I'm a smaller woman, I'd asked my husband to go with me in case I killed something so he could help me pack it out. Unfortunately, he could not go that night due to work obligations. Fine, no problem. I'd hunted on this farm many times by myself, and I knew it like the back of my hand. I strapped on my boots, grabbed my rifle and binoculars, tucked my cell phone into my pocket, and made my way to my Jeep. My grandmother's farm consists of corn bordering an alfalfa field along a river. Between the river and the farm are lines of old growth trees. This is the perfect place to fill a buck tag. I parked my Jeep about a mile upriver from the fields, then began walking along the tree line toward the area where most of the deer had been feeding. At the opposite end of the field, there was a large haystack where all the harvested alfalfa was stored. As I saw it coming into my field of vision, I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I knelt down and viewed the area through my binoculars. I could see a very tall, large man come out from behind the haystack and start walking briskly towards me. I knew for a fact that I was supposed to be the only one hunting this farm on this night, as I had just spoken to my grandmother. Something inside me told me I needed to get out of the area as quickly as I could. I initially tried to turn around and walk back down the trees to my Jeep, but given that I have such short legs, this guy was quickly closing the gap. He was still several hundred yards from me, so I decided to try to cross the river instead, but I found that the river was too muddy and too deep for me to safely cross. I thought my only option was to attempt to get a signal on my cell phone. When the man walked across a small ditch and disappeared from my line of sight, I quickly darted into the corn and kept quiet. I could hear him walking closer and closer. I desperately tried to call my husband. Back then, the closest cell towers were over 30 miles away, and cell service was extremely spotty. I could not connect to my husband or 911. By this point, the man was within 100 yards of me. I could hear him ripping corn out, stomping around, and loudly cussing. Where the fuck did you go?" he yelled. It was getting dark quickly, and I definitely did not want to be in the dark alone with this man. I watched him for a few minutes and was able to determine that he did not have a gun. After weighing my options, I decided to step out and see if I could de-escalate the situation, as I work in healthcare and work with mentally unstable people all the time. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the corn. "Hi, I'm sorry if I interrupted your hunt. I didn't mean to cause you any harm," I said with a sweet smile on my face. I made sure there were at least 80 yards between us. His eyes locked with mine, and it was obvious there was something wrong with this man. He stood about 6'5" tall. His clothes were absolutely filthy, stained with what appeared to be his own waste and sweat. His shirt was torn and had dried blood on it. His face was crooked as if he had had a stroke prior, and he slurred his words. "There you fucking are," he yelled. He reached down and grabbed a massive stick. I'm talking a stick at least 5 feet long. He could have easily killed me with it. I stood my ground, grabbed my rifle from my back, and pointed it at him. He dropped the stick. We looked at each other for a second, then he began yelling, "Do you know whose farm you're on?" I said, "Yes, this is my grandmother's farm. I've hunted on it my whole life." The veins began to pop out of his head. "No, this is not. My wife is hunting in this cornfield and you ruined it. Because of you, she missed a huge buck, you stupid bitch." He became so enraged and started making strange growling sounds and started spitting everywhere. I was running through the options in my head at this point when he suddenly started to lunge at me. I turned the safety off my rifle and shouted, "Stop! I will shoot if I have to." He froze in his tracks and just stared at me for about 30 seconds before dropping the stick. He grunted loudly with his eyes darting around. "Listen, I don't want to have to do something we will both regret. I'm very sorry I ruined your hunt. If you turn around and walk away from me, I will leave," I said calmly. I could see him thinking hard about what to do next until he finally mumbled, "Fine," and turned around, stomping back towards the haystack. My heart was about to beat out of my chest. I was not about to turn my back on this man, though. I watched until he walked a safe distance away, and then I darted back into the corn. I thought back on how he said I spooked a massive buck and ruined his wife's hunt. It doesn't make any sense. I had a good view of the whole field, and there were no deer present. I took out my binoculars to observe him. I watched him tramp over to the haystack and then get into a small 2-door white car nearby. He quickly peeled out of the haystack lot. I was able to catch that the car had California license plates, but I couldn't make out the license plate number. I live nowhere near California. He took off down the road alone. No one else was in that vehicle. I ran back to my Jeep and locked myself in. I sped home as fast as I could and told my husband what happened. I had never seen this man in my life, and neither had my husband, based on the description. We live in a community of about 200 people. Born and raised here, we know everyone. I called our local sheriff, who came out and took a statement. I took the sheriff to the haystack where the man had been parked, and we found a knife lying on the ground. Of course, nothing could be done as I was not able to get a plate number or a name from the man. To this day, I still have no idea what the man's intentions were, but I can guess a few. It's been 8 years, and I've never seen this man again. From then on, I decided I'd always be hunting with a buddy.
Want more Disturbed? Check out our Patreon for member-exclusive content, early merch access, and other cool perks. I'm your host, Doug Bailey, and this has been Disturbed, a production of Killer Podcasts and part of the Evergreen Network. For more paranormal and true crime shows, visit killerpodcasts.com. Follow our social channels at Disturbed Podcast on Instagram or Disturbed_pod on Twitter. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and reviewing on your favorite listening platform. Share your own true horror story at disturbedpodcast.com. Music by Epidemic Sound and by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Our producer is Elizabeth Flood. Our sound designer and audio engineer is Nathan Corson. Executive producers Bridget Korn and Noah Fouts. Until next time, stay safe out there.
My name is Bill Huffman, and I am a former Cleveland news producer, and I am now the host of the podcast, Who Killed? I began the show focusing on the unsolved murder of Amy Mihalovic, and now each week I explore a different case with a focus on some of the victims who don't get the attention they deserve. I have a deep catalog of over 225 episodes, so there is a guarantee there will be something for you. Who Killed is an Evergreen Podcasts, Killer Podcasts, and Slow Burn Media production. Subscribe today wherever you get your favorite shows.